Good afternoon. This is Nic Flores speaking. I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, Dr. João Florêncio, who, because of forces outside of our control, will be joining us virtually today. Dr. Florêncio is senior lecturer in the history of modern and contemporary art and visual culture at the University of Exeter. A queer cultural theorist of the body and its visual cultures, his research investigates the ways in which the body has been produced, policed, and contested as a site of creative world-making in modern contemporary cultures. João's work has appeared in journals like Porn Studies, Sexuality, Performance Research, and Semiotics, among others. João has also produced a research documentary titled Oink as part of his AHRC Leadership Fellows Project, Masculinities and the Ethics of Porosity in Post-AIDS Gay Porn. His monograph, Bareback Porn, Porous Masculinities, Queer Futures, The Ethics of Becoming Pig, was published last year, 2020, by Routledge. In it, he analyzes contemporary gay pig masculinities, which have developed alongside antiretroviral therapies, online porn, and new sexualized patterns of recreational drug use. The work examines pornographic representations and practices, speculating on their ethical and biopolitical dimensions in relation to modern European histories, ideologies, and conceptualizations of the male body. In this work and others, Dr. Florêncio draws our attention to contemporary visual sites and practices that, as he writes in his conclusion, enable possibilities for new kinds of subjectivity, of embodiment, and of ethical relationships with others. One of the many things I appreciate about this monograph and its forceful articulations on piggy pleasures is its pedagogical premises. That is, Dr. Florêncio simultaneously maps out the various circuits of piggy pleasures and visual possibilities of embodiment, and, as I observe, offers blueprints for how we might open ourselves up to the pig in all of us. I urge everyone to engage his work and encounter the pleasure in his presentation. Thank you in helping me virtually welcome Dr. João Florêncio today.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much to Nic for such nice introduction. Thank you to Tim for organizing this and everyone at the Krannert Art Museum. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be there with you, and that's my last acknowledgement. I'd like to thank the U.S. Embassy in London for that fact. I will now share my screen with you. Which, oh God, where is this? What am I sharing? Let me see. Oh, I'm sharing the wrong thing. I'll share my screen with you, which you hopefully can see. And is this all okay? Yeah. Okay, I will start. Well, if identity is only a game, it is only a procedure to have relations, social and sexual, pleasure relationships that create new friendships. It is useful. But if identity becomes the problem of sexual existence, and if people think that they have to uncover their own identity, and that their own identity has to become the law, the principle, the code of their existence, if the perennial question they ask is, does this thing conform to my identity? Then I think they will turn back to a kind of ethics very close to the old heterosexual virility. If we are asked to relate to the question of identity, it must be an identity to our unique selves. But the relationships we have to have with ourselves are not ones of identity. Rather, they must be relationships of differentiation, of creation, of innovation. To be the same is really boring. Thus, realism, badly named, at any rate often badly interpreted, consists not in copying the real, but in copying a depicted copy of the real, code upon code known as realism. This is why realism cannot be designed a copier, but rather a pastiche. Through secondary mimesis, it copies what is already a copy. Once the infinite circularity of codes is posited, the body itself cannot escape it. The real body, fictionally given as such, is the replication of a model set forth by that code of the arts, so that the most natural of bodies is always only the promise of the artistic code from which it has previously issued. Thus, even within realism, the codes never stop. Bodily replication cannot be interrupted, save by living nature. The faggots lived with the men without ever being part of the men. It was necessary to develop secret ways to know each other. Vibrations passed through the eyes and the tips of the fingers were the ways the faggots knew each other. Once they learned to find each other anywhere they went, they learned that they were everywhere. Then they began to talk to each other and to love each other in earnest. And then slowly the faggots taught each other a trick. They learned how to be active in front of the man without identifying with the man. They learned how to do for the man without being used by the man. They could smile inside as they performed. They could laugh no matter what the outcome of their actions for the men were. They began to detach their souls from the man while leaving their bodies visibly available for activity. The faggots learned that they could create the men's masterpieces, educate the children, cook their food, arrange their gardens, plan their houses, work in their factories, and rub their backs without caring how it all turned out. They learned how the oppressed survived. I decided to start my talk with the three quotations I've just read, because I think in their being presented alongside one another, those paragraphs by Foucault, Barthes, and Mitchell help open up a vista into the questions, concerns, and thinking I would like to share and discuss with you today. Namely, the queer politics of sampling and seriality, as I will try to map them onto two different practices of cloning. The cloning that was at the center of the gay male poetics of sexual life of the 1970s in places like San Francisco and New York, and cloning as it belongs to the very ontology of photography, and as I wish to claim, of its queer potential made manifest in the work of Hal Fischer. To that end, my plan is to highlight and index the resonances between the figure of the gay clone and photographic practices such as Fischer's, in which cloning was both content and form. In particular, I want to attend to the ways in which both the gay clone and Fischer's work sample pre-existing codes of signifying structures or signifying structures of heteropatriarchal life, remixing, modulating, and replicating them into new aesthetic series imbued with an especially queer investment, not in the discovery of the self, but rather in the forging of the new from the ruins of a haunting past. 1. Perhaps most famously studied by Martin Levine in Gay Macho, The Life and Death of the Homosexual Clone, so-called clones were a particular kind of gay masculinity that emerged during the 1970s in cities like San Francisco and New York, in response to predominant cultural stereotypes that had associated homosexuality, especially receptive homosexuality, with effeminacy, due to the ways in which penetrability and receptivity has historically been seen in modern heteropatriarchal culture as a marker of female or feminized bodies. As a way of rejecting those associations that in a sexist culture such as ours have also been associated with intellectual immaturity, arrested development, and lack of political autonomy, some gay men, Levine tells us, started developing styles of self-presentation that borrowed from or sampled traditional styles of masculine self-presentation, especially those associated with working class or blue-collar US masculinities. They did so by wishing with their hearts their dreams into being. They adopted utilitarian clothing normally worn by cowboys, bikers, manual laborers, or athletes, and developed particular codes of body language that refer back to those kinds of hypermasculinity without really being them. More than simply repeating them, the gay clones sampled and remixed codes of masculinity in ways that allowed them to be read as men by the dominant heterosexual culture and thus potentially avoid homophobic violence, while simultaneously developing a particular syntax of masculine self-presentation that still allowed them not only to be read as gay men by other gay men, but also to signal specific sexual tastes while doing so. As Levine writes, there was always a delicate interplay between a straight imitation and variation to make certain that others would know they were not only real men, but real gay men. After all, those very men that the clone imitated also manifest the most sharply homophobic attitudes and were perhaps the most likely to be feared for physical violence and gay bashing. One might want to imitate the presentational style of masculinity, but one may not have wanted to confront it in real life. That might be dangerous. Plus, one wanted to attract other gay men, so the right men needed to notice the visual cues. The delicacy of imitation without inappropriate signaling requires significant impression management skills, using traditionally masculine styles in the service of obviously gay purposes. Clones were also extremely self-aware of putting on an act in their performances of masculinity, as noted by the ease with which they were able to move between hyper-masculine self-presentation, predominant in cruising scenarios, and the more gender-bending speech patterns such as cross-gendered pronouns and more campy poses that tended to emerge in informal gatherings of friends. This, to Levine, belies masculine identification and suggests that while some clones still might have equated homosexuality with effeminacy, clones were equally adept at both genres of gender display. Both masculinity and femininity were a form of drag, a put on, which could just as easily be taken off. The clone was not, therefore, trying to express some kind of essential truth about their identities and gender, but instead demonstrated a critical awareness of the performative nature of identities and gendered expressions, how they emerge from an iterative process that involves not only quotation, as Butler has famously argued, but also, in the case of queer identities and clone identities in particular, practices of sampling and creative remixing capable of creating the new from the ruins of the old. Such claim and Levine's reading of the clone as an instance of drag resonates closely with Mo Meyer's study of the queer politics and poetics of camp aesthetics as a parody of dominant signifying systems. When parody is seen as a process, not as form, then the relationship between texts becomes simply an indicator of the power relationships between social agents who wield those texts. One who possesses the original, the other who possesses the parodic alternative. Accordingly, value production is the prerogative of the dominant order, dominant precisely because it controls signification and which is represented by the privilege of nominating its own codes as the original. The original, then, is the signifier of dominant presence. And because dominance can be defined as such only by exercising control over signification, it is only through the original that we can know and touch that power. In that case, parody becomes the process whereby the marginalized and disenfranchised advance their own interests by entering alternative signifying codes into discourse, by attaching them to existing structures of signification. There are two elements of Meyer's analysis that are especially helpful to reflect not only on clones as identitarian homosexual formations, but on cloning as a queer political process of sampling and remixing that at once appropriates and transforms the signifying codes that structure and make visible identities, cultures, intimacies, and sanctioned forms of sociability. First, there is Meyer's consistent deployment of original within quotation marks to define it not as the first and truly authentic entity of which all others are copies, but rather as a special status conferred by the dominant culture to an object purely on the basis that it functions as a signifier for that very same dominant culture. According to that reasoning, which also echoes Butler's work on drag and Lacanian work on the symbolic, the original is any cultural code that is given in culture and sustained in time through the power relations at the center of what Michel Foucault defined as an episteme, that is, the specific rules that give form to the legitimate forms of knowledge of a particular historical and cultural period. Second, and as a result of the first point, given that the only cultural codes available to minoritized groups are those produced by the dominant order through its owning and of the coding apparatus of signification, the only way in which subcultures can produce meanings of their own is by appropriating and transforming them, that is, through sampling and remixing, in such a way that new subcultural meanings are attached to them. Such a view also very much resonates with some of the main postulates that emerge from the study of media and subcultural formations carried out by scholars working in the post-war British cultural studies tradition, such as Stuart Hall, Dick Ebditch, or Sarah Thornton. Sampling and remixing of dominant cultural codes have therefore historically been at the core of the poetics of existence of marginalized or subjugated communities. As Legacy Russell noted in Glitch Feminism, her recent book Manifesto, queer people, people of color, and female-identified people have an enduring and historical relationship to the notion of remix. To remix is to rearrange, to add on an original recording. The spirit of remixing is about finding ways to innovate with what's been given, creating something new from something already there. Remixing is an act of self-determination. It is a technology of survival. 2. By now, you will hopefully have noted that I have been talking about clones in a way that has focused on queer cloning as a form of corruption of dominant structures of signification to an introduction of viral codes at the moment of replication. Rather than being merely instances of copying, queer cloning takes up heteropatriarchal codes and corrupts them before replicating them. In my argument, then, I have been primarily concerned with positioning the act of cloning at the interfacing of queerness with the dominant culture rather than within queer cultures themselves. According to this reading, and as I aim to further elucidate in what remains of my talk, the clones of San Francisco or New York were not just clones of one another, but each of them individually corrupted queer clones of dominant masculinities. Repositioning cloning as a process of queer world making that takes place at the interface of dominant culture and subculture has a few advantages, I think. First of all, it helps highlighting the power relations that sustain all signifying regimes as well as their reproduction. Second, it strengthens our understanding of clones as parodic kinds of gender performance, and therefore as forms of queer appropriation. Through cloning, my dear, you are a homosexual. Finally, it helps navigating some of the challenges and tensions we encounter within queer scholarship on clones, namely the ways in which it has tended to be guided by a political epistemology that favors difference as the space of queerness, to the detriment of sameness. Referring to clone culture in his legendary 1978 interview with Jean Lebitou, Foucault set out the framework through which clones would continue to be read for decades to follow. That is, not as mere copies of the old, but rather as instances of something new, of something different. At the moment, what seems to be happening in the United States could appear to be a kind of reflex movement, as if they were falling back onto a monosexual machismo, where men flaunt all the signs of masculinity in order to keep to themselves. But in the end, when you look at this a little more closely, what strikes me is that all these get-ups, all this brazen masculinity, absolutely do not coincide with a revaluation of the male as male. On the contrary, these uses of the body could be defined as desexualized, as devirilized, like fist fucking or other extraordinary fabrications of pleasure, which Americans reach with the help of certain drugs or instruments. In short, they use the signs of masculinity, but not at all to return to something that would be of the order of phallocratism or machismo, but rather to invent themselves, to allow themselves to make their masculine body a place for the production of extraordinary polymorphous pleasures, detached from the valorizations of sex, and particularly the male sex. Foucault's insistence on the ways in which the clone veered away from the formations that structure patriarchy will be subsequently critiqued by Leo Berzani, who directed a friendly accusation towards Foucault for what he saw as the latter's excessive focus on the aesthetics of clone sexuality, which overlooked its self-shattering power. Whitney Davis, too, in his book Queer Beauty, notes that Foucault's fascination with the clones he had encountered in the Castro was also likely very much informed by the subculture's own contemporary self-mythologizing, encountered in texts like Larry Townshend's Leatherman's Handbook, Jeff Main's Urban Aboriginals, or John Preston's stories that regularly appeared on the pages of Drummer, the Bible of the Clone. The clones were a subcultural formation, and like all subcultural formations, governed by sets of rules, patterns of taste and consumption, and strategies of self-distinction, as amply argued by scholars working the British cultural studies tradition. Therefore, as Davis writes, however its facts and its fictions were mediated to Foucault and combined with his theoretical, literary, and other expectations, gay leather sex of the late 1970s and early 1980s can readily be understood as a discipline in the earlier Foucauldian sense. It is much harder to see it as the spontaneity that the later Foucault found in it. A different reading of gay clone cultures has been advanced by Tim Dean in his essay Sameness Without Identity, in which Dean goes to great lengths to counteract critiques of the clone that had reduced it to either a mere, quote, narcissist disavowal of difference, or, quote, a racist, misogynist, and ultimately homophobic formation. For Dean, both those critiques fail to account for what clone aesthetics truly hints at, and that is the level of what he calls ontological differentiation, or sameness, that precedes all formations of identity and difference. Building on the work of Berzani and Ulysse Tutois on art and aesthetics, for Dean, the aesthetics of impersonality embodied by the clone is a form of inaccurate self-replication that, to quote from one of his earlier essays, entails neither finding the self in the other, as in a mirror image, nor conversely suddenly becoming aware of the other in the self, as in an eruption of the unconscious or the uncanny. Instead, inaccurate self-replication entails a type of identification that, generated as part of the communication of forms, substantially undermines the very terms self and other. In his argument, therefore, the example of the gay clone helps us make a distinction between sameness and difference as structured by the imaginary and the ontological sameness or impersonality that Berzani associated with homonness. To him, gay clones are nothing but, quote, superficial instances of a more profound sameness that de-individuates subjectivity, end of quote, and are therefore always in excess of any relationships between self and other as shaped by the imaginary and symbolic other orders. As Dean puts it, in a clearly hyperbolic manner, in practice, if not in theory, North American gay men are mostly Lacanians, end of quote. Yet, just like Foucault would perhaps have been too inebriated by his night at the barracks, and by the soft mythology of the clones with whom he certainly had a jolly good time, to acknowledge the disciplinary dimensions that clone culture as a culture necessarily had, Dean too tries to compensate for the clone's aesthetic of sameness by framing it as a kind of heuristic that points towards a more primordial or originary realm of higher value. Just like the value of aesthetics in the likes of Freud or Bezzani is tethered to its ability to function as a means to get what really matters, that is the pre-subjective workings of the psyche. In this psychoanalytical reading, the value of the clone lies not in himself, but in his ability to index and elsewhere, where identity formations break down. Referring directly to this analysis, Ben Nichols puts it thus: in specifically queer theoretical discourse, where clones or related ideas around identical repetition in queer culture have been addressed, it has not been to celebrate a simple investment in being like others or the enjoyment of sameness, but rather to recuperate this figure, sorry for the typo, to prestigious theoretical models about the dissolution of self, meaning, and language. Against these kinds of strong theory and grand ontological gestures, Nichols notes how identity, the experience of sameness and recognition of the self in the other, offer the possibility of pleasure and empowerment, and moreover show no sign of becoming any less operative or significant. Despite the anti-identitarian rallying of queer studies since the 1990s. In order to navigate these tensions, I would like to attend more closely to the actual practices of sampling and remixing that I am associating with cloning as an aesthetics of queer existence, rather than wishing to tether the value of the clone exclusively to how it may at heart be anti-identitarian, as both Foucault and Dean did in very different ways. I want to acknowledge its value and significance as a sexual script that fosters habitus, and through that sustains forms of intersubjective recognition and collective empowerment along the lines drawn up by Nichols. At the same time, I want to keep from both Foucault and Dean their interest in the clone as the outcome of a political process of transgressive reiteration or inaccurate repetition that is generative of difference. I want to attend to cloning as a queer methodology of sampling and remixing that is deployed politically for the actualization of new aesthetic forms. In doing so, I will read cloning through and into Hal Fischer's photographic practice. I will argue that cloning was not merely the subject, but the actual methodology of Fischer's 1970s photographs of gay men and spaces in the Castro, to such an extent that both the making of the 70s gay man and his documentation at the hands of Fischer are instances of the same kind of queer poetics or queer world-making practice. 3. Hal Fischer's photography practice is first and foremost concerned with beats, with queer temporality as a chronic repetition capable of collapsing straight distinctions between old and new into a creative serialization of the same. Disco, house, techno, the ins and outs of the dark room, the faces that blur into one another in Hampstead Heath, at the departed Chelsea Piers, up and down the Castro, Thomas Phelan's Pleasure Park, all our going ups, coming downs, and back again. All of the coming upon ourselves and into ourselves, again and again, in waves of amethyst and gray. For Fischer, just like for the men he photographed, the singular is not anathema to the same. Rather, it is the repetition of the same that brings us closer to grasping the singular, to grasping difference. Like we also see in Arnold Schoenberg, oh my God. Just like the mechanical reproduction of images does away with the quest for the original and its aura, just like in Saussure, the sign is only meaningful insofar as it is sustained by a closed system of differences and repetitions with no reference. So too does the gay clone call into question the purported originality of the heterosexual man it parodies. Seriality, whether in music, in art, or in gay life, is an aesthetic practice of chronic sampling and remixing that repeats the given with such force it undoes the original of its identity as original. With such force it undoes its identity as original. As Deleuze writes of the simulacrum is the sign insofar as the sign interiorizes the conditions of its own repetition. The simulacrum seizes upon a constituent disparity in the thing from which it strips the rank of model. Just like with the sign, every repetition of an image only ever points back to another prior repetition, code upon code, known as realism, as Barthes writes in SZ. These incessant repetitions, the seriality we see in Schoenberg, Cage, Warhol, Fischer, or in the clones that were the subject of the latter's own work, highlight the inner emptiness of all signs, incapable as they are of being read when extracted from the scaffolding systems that arrest their meaning. A case in point, the hanky. Handkerchiefs signify behavioral tendencies through both color and placement. A blue handkerchief placed in the right hip pocket serves notice that the wearer desires to play the passive role during sexual intercourse. Conversely, a blue handkerchief placed in the left pocket indicated that the wearer will assume the active or traditional male role during sexual contact. The blue handkerchief is commonly used in the treatment of nasal congestion, and in some cases holds no meaning in regard to sexual preference. In his series Gay Semiotics, Fischer stresses the emptiness of signifiers when isolated from the cultural contexts and internal systems of difference that are single-handedly responsible for their signification. Repetition, therefore, becomes not simply the replication of the same, but a necessary condition for the apprehension of difference. For it is only through repetition that the singular can be grasped and read as singular. Repetition is required for intelligibility. Gay semiotics reveals how the meaning of that which is repeated is not tethered to the meaning of a putative original, but rather to the power of repetition itself. In so doing, the series enacts the reversion of Platonism, Deleuze asked of philosophy, with a claim that repetition, as enacted in the Nietzschean concept of eternal return, swallows up or destroys every ground which would function as an instance responsible for the difference between the original and the derived, between things and the simulacra. It makes us party to a universal ungrounding. Through repetition, being and becoming are synthesized. All we need to think this thought is to stop believing in being as distinct from and opposed to becoming, or to believe in the being of becoming itself. It is not being that returns, but rather the returning itself that constitutes being, insofar as it is a fund of becoming and of that which passes. In other words, identity in the eternal return does not describe the nature of that which returns, but on the contrary, the fact of returning for that which differs. This is why eternal return must be thought of as a synthesis of time and its dimensions, a synthesis of diversity and its reproduction, a synthesis of becoming and the being, which is affirmed in becoming, a synthesis of double affirmation. In issuing the single photograph on behalf of the series, Fischer foregrounds that ungrounding of the original and the derived in a synthesis of being and becoming. He turns that synthesis into a static form to show that identity, originality, and meaning are nothing but epiphenomena of difference in eternal repetition. Take a look at keys, for instance. Keys are an understood signifier for homosexual activity. A keychain worn on the right side of the body indicates that the wearer wishes to play a passive role during a sexual encounter. Conversely, keys placed on the left side of the body signify that the wearer expect to assume a dominant position. Keys are also worn by janitors, laborers, and other workers with no sexual signification intended. Pointing to a similar logic of tension between singularity and repetition found at the heart of the avant-garde, Rosalind Krauss notes the following. Marinetti, thrown from his automobile one evening in 1909 into a factory ditch filled with water, emerges as if from amniotic fluid to be born without ancestors, a futurist. The self as origin is the way an absolute distinction can be made between a present experienced de novo and a tradition-laden past. The claims of the avant-garde are precisely these claims for originality. Now, if the very notion of the avant-garde can be seen as a function of the discourse of originality, the actual practice of avant-garde art tends to reveal that originality is a working assumption that itself emerges from a ground of repetition and recurrence. Pointing to a similar logics of tension between singularity and repetition found at the heart of the avant-garde. Oh, sorry, I just read that. I need to change my page. I know we're just kind of repeating and reiterating. So looking at recurring presences in avant-garde practices that nonetheless thought of themselves as producing singularities ex nihilo, Krauss gives us, as one of her earliest examples, a pictorial tradition of landscape to show how the singularity of a particular landscape was always dependent on it being recognized as such, as landscape, and therefore on its ability to refer back to prior iterations of itself. Although the singular and the formulaic or repetitive may be semantically opposed, they are nonetheless conditions of each other, the two logical halves of the concept of landscape. Concept of landscape. From the picturesque landscapes of William Gilpin or Constable to avant-garde works as diverse as those of Monet, Mondrian, or Rauschenberg, it was the copy that served as the ground for the development of an increasingly organized and codified sign or scene or semen of spontaneity. An aesthetics of repetition or of copy without original is at the core of cloning, as it emerged in the 1970s as a form of queer world making, both on the streets of the Castro and in Hal Fischer's approach to photography. Not as much of a picturesque landscape as it was a sexual clonescape, these new visions of gay life were only new insofar as they were reiterations of pre-existing codes of masculinity, which had been dismantled and reassembled into new configurations of existence and desire, while at the same time, and importantly, delivering to gay men the possibility of recognition or legibility of the self in the new. A form of difference that is nonetheless a kind of resemblance, where the singular and the plural, the different and the same, all collapse into one another, as if caught in the middle of one of Rauschenberg's combines. Like a combine, the clone was both a monument and a ruin. As Brandon Joseph writes of the fragments that Rauschenberg assembled in his combines, the signifying codes reassembled in cloning as an aesthetics of queer existence have been disembodied from their existence in a particular historical place and time. And as repetitions or reproductions of repetitions, the images, even those of old master paintings, have been emptied of the integrity of their contents. However, while Rauschenberg had no interest in redeeming the combined fragments through reconstructing new meanings out of the ruins of a past, for the clone, redemption through new meaning and self-recognition was fundamentally a strategy of queer survival. It was in his ability to become legible by another within a subcultural infrastructure of signification and intimacy that the clone found the scaffolding needed for a new collective architecture of sexuality and being. It was in identity that the clone was able to affirm his differential becoming. If, to paraphrase Deleuze, the clone rode the verbs of pure becoming all the way through to where substantives and adjectives began to dissolve and identity disappeared from the self and the world, he did so only to reassemble the ruins of those signifiers into a new monument, intelligible only to his brothers. Monument after monument, horny cigarettes leaning against the walls of a bar, one pair of ripped Levi's after another, the chiaroscuro of a perfect crotch vanishing in the horizon, the 4Ds of disco, drugs, dish, and dick. The clone was a rhythm, a new collective frequency, so identical and yet so different from what came before that it could only be perceived as an acoustic beat, an interference emerging from two kinds of masculinity so different and yet so close together that a beat tone was produced with a period equivalent to the difference in their frequencies. Clones were a rhythm to dance to. You make me feel mighty real. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, João. And I'm really regretful that...
Is the main room muted or something like that?
No, you're not muted. Am I muted?
We are muted.
I don't know where you are. I don't know which direction to look. I don't know whether to look at the camera. Okay.
You're looking at me. You're looking straight into my
João.
eyes.
Thank you, João. And I do admit to feeling somewhat interpellated by your presentation, and I had completely forgotten that I had ever written about clones. So thank you for that return of the repressed, João. And I am very sorry that you couldn't be here. We are having such a nice time, but we miss you, and we hate the American Embassy in London for denying your passage. I do have a question, but I'm as somebody who is completely discombobulated by a camera. My brain is freezing as I'm looking into a camera, and the fact that you are not in the room to look at is profoundly disturbing to me. So I'm going to hand over to the audience before I ask my question. Question from Lilia Kaganovsky from our Department of Comparative Literature.
Hi, thank you for that. It was wonderful. So my question is about the musicality, right? Of all the music metaphors that you have. You talk about sampling, you talk about the clone as rhythm, and I was just curious, given the very visual nature of the work that we're looking at, and the fact that all of the codes are about visual legibility, how do we make that connection to the musical?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I think maybe the background to this, that I originally trained as a musicologist. Even in my work on porn, one of the things that most interests me is ideas of rhythm and pattern. I think that with regards to this particular kind of work, like Hal's work, the issue of temporality to me is really what immediately comes across, and I think, and connecting that to discourse on queer temporality, like Elizabeth Freeman and etc. because ultimately, to me, the kind of the construction of subjectivity is a deeply, to me, and people like Freeman, so I'm taking it of her work, has a lot to do with temporality. And I think sometimes we even in visual culture and art history, we tend to speak to the image in isolation. And what strikes me about this and about Hal's work is how the repetition, how the shape of the series really invites us to think about the work primarily as pattern, because it is in those gaps between those images that something can be grasped. I think, it's like the gaps between each. I mean, now thinking a bit old school analogy, the gaps between the frames in film. It is in that space from one still to another that something is produced. And I mean, to me, it would be impossible to think about clones or to think about Hal's work without thinking about rhythm, without thinking about pattern, and also to recognize, again, like we've seen, that I made reference to Thomas Finland's Pleasure Park, which I've also written about in my book. And if we attend to the space between each body, the space between things that resemble, it's in that space that we can find the potential, and that we can understand the creative power of what's going on. I don't know if I'm really making sense, but clones and disco and dancing, suddenly, the whole thing makes a lot of sense to me.
It's very interesting what you just said, João, to think about the serial quality of Hal's photographic series as the visual series as inscribed in a temporality that has a rhythm. That's very. I'm glad you said that. That's given me something to think about. And I feel that your comments about rhythm and form and a pleasure, I feel questions being generated to my right. I'm going to hand the microphone to Hal Fischer.
Oh, God.
Hi, Joel. I'm not going to say anything terribly profound, but I want to say it's good to meet you. But I want to say something about your selection of Sylvester, because when we were selecting titles for my most recent book, Mighty Real was one of the titles that I chose because of Sylvester. So you were definitely onto something subconsciously that was going on with me.
Thank you so much. I mean, I will say that actually that Levi. This also, I mean, this comes from that sense in the kind of that the question is not so much are you real, but you just make me feel mighty real. That tension between the kind of artifice, between the show and the undoing of the authentic and the copy, to me, is really embodied in that song. But also, it's not the first time certainly not the first time it's been used in relation to clone culture, because it's also, I took the cue from Levine's book, where each chapter is named after a disco track. So, I can't claim ownership of that either. But then again, we're not talking. I think the point of what we're doing today is actually to kind of not claim ownership of anything.
Questions? Okay, João, I'm going to not look at you on the screen, I'm going to look at you in the camera. Here's my question. You said at one point that cloning involves a corruption of the codes and that it's from the ruins of the old that something new emerges. And even as you quoted Rosalind Krauss in her kind of critique of the avant-garde, I feel a kind of maybe unwarranted optimism about the new, right? The new that emerges after things have been corrupted and the codes have been remixed. There is a kind of optimism there that what emerges will be intelligible, right? It will be readable, it will be understandable, and that we can work with it, use it, and somehow achieve our desires. And so I'm wondering about the first moment in which the codes are corrupted. Why does anything work after that, right? That is, why does signification succeed? Why is resignification a political promise as opposed to the index of a political failure? And you can hear in my question, the question is directed to you, but beyond you to some of the thinkers you're working with. So I wonder if you could talk about remixing when one thinks about music makes sense. When one thinks about signification more broadly, it becomes more problematic. So I'm wondering about the infelicity and all the failures that happen post-corruption of the codes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I mean, I like to think that, I hope I'm not going to start doing a lot of like viral metaphors. You know, there's a certain level of randomness to a code that is corrupted. And you know, it may not be read, it may not function, it may not plug or connect or translate, you know. The virus needs somehow to, you know, a mutation needs to, in order for it to be successful, needs to somehow pass by the cell it wants to infect, right? It needs to be read as something, and so there's and you know, obviously for the success of the virus, not for the success of the cell, it infects of the host. I think that when it comes to signification, I mean, certainly the signification is a way of disciplining the creative power of the corruption, right? Of the moment of corruption, of the moment of mutation. To me, and it's also necessary for, and it's that disciplining that ensures the signification, right? I mean, there needs to be a cultural, you know, a linguistic environment, if you want, a linguistic community that is able to read the sign. Otherwise, the sign is just meaningless. You know, the virus needs to be read by the cell, so the virus needs to, you know, needs to become cell, and I'm gonna go all the loose again, like the wasp and the orchid. The wasp needs to become orchid, and the orchid needs to, they need to see one another. They need to read one another. But that's the potential of it too, is that the corruption of the code becomes meaningless, politically meaningless, if it is a complete corruption. So it needs to have something there that allows it to infiltrate itself, like a Trojan horse. If what you are asking is about my optimism, I mean, I am optimistic. I'd say that I'm less of a Lacanian than I think you are. And to me, the importance of being read, of being seen, is really important, has been really important. You know, the importance of not kind of, you know, ending up hooking up with someone that doesn't read my cues is really important. And signification is really important for community building, or at least for the formation of allegiances. So yes, the code is where the creative potential lies, is where the potential for the new lies, but without the disciplining that comes of it, that new doesn't have, you know, material consequences. If that does that answer your question?
I think it addresses my question, and I wished you were here because we could continue the question. And I feel there was a moment we did not see in the presentation when you, having quoted a bit about the nasal discharge, I feel like you actually maybe used your red bandana to blow your nose. Yeah. We heard a sound, we didn't see it, but I just wanted to, I think that happened.
Yeah, so I had it. It was a little performance. So I had it here and I took it out and blew my nose. So I see, I was doing the Hal Fischer.
And we didn't see it, right? We just saw your slides, so we got a hint of that. Do we have other questions? I'm conscious of the time and of keeping us on some kind of schedule. João, I think we are going to thank you for being with us here in this virtual way, despite everything, and for giving us lots of food for thought. And I hope we will find ways to continue the dialogue. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you.